Well, this is the next walk and talk, and this is the next bit of our look at what's been happening with Ukraine, particularly in thinking about the um, fallout from the events in the White House between Donald Trump and JD Vance and Volodymyr Zelensky, and I've been just using it as a launchpad just to think about some things. Now, remember that I'm speaking as a Christian. I'm mainly speaking for Christians, though other people may have an interest in this from just because of the topic. And so my aim at the end of this video series is to be getting us to think getting us to think Christianly about this, and my aim will be to pull all these things together and then to start to look and see how do we get God's perspective on the Ukraine conflict as it is at the moment. But first of all, what I've been trying to encourage us to do is to first of all see and read clearly and get a sense of what is happening and understanding it, reading the picture. That's important. It's important for us to know how we're to live as Christians, how we're just to live in these times. We need to know what is going on, what the times are, if you like, and that means there's a big sense in which it's important for Christians to follow current affairs, to understand what's going on in the world. It's important for us to do the groundwork, and I would say if you are a student, a younger person, you're still in your studies, that's at university or even earlier than that, and you've tuned into this, then what I want to encourage you with is this, that those things matter. They matter for life, but they matter for living life as a Christian, because you want to be well informed, and that means studying history, geography, maths, science, engineering, law, all this literature, all of those things matter, and they're relevant, and they are helpful to you. And what I'd encourage you to be doing is to be doing the hard work of those studies, but also be thinking about how do I train my mind to think Christianly, to think biblically about these things. I would encourage parents to be thinking about children, to make sure that your children have a really good, robust education. But our responsibility is to make sure that that's Christian education as well. And that means helping them to see what they're studying, what they're learning from God's perspective and from the Bible's perspective. That means that we need to be engaged with what they are learning, pay attention to what they're reading, what they're studying, what they're watching. Now, by the way, I realise that this is becoming a walk and talk on a different topic to the one I intended. Fire brigade just going past there, something's picking up somewhere. I think we're going to put this as a kind of offshoot video that deals specifically with this topic now, rather than what I was originally going to talk about, because it's significant in its own right and it's relevant here. Because there's a whole debate around, isn't there, about education, Christian education, our responsibility. This has been flagged up recently because of a couple of things. First of all, the government's decision to impose VAT on private schools. That's affecting a lot of Christian schools, and also there's been some discussions about requirements to register and give details about what is happening with a few home educators. And so, yeah, I'm just going to stop and say something about those things. Because what you'll have noticed is that I've just said that I believe that education needs to be Christian education, that our children need to be learning things in a way that enables them to see God's perspective on life. And in that sense, there is nothing outside of God's domain. That all of our knowledge, all of our thoughts are about thinking God's thoughts after Him. And so, yes, there is a sense in which mathematics, your algebra, your second order differential equations, how literature, poetry, Shakespeare, how science can and should be Christian. And when I'm talking about science there, I don't just mean when you get into debates about evolution or creation, and I don't just mean science in terms of bioethics and end and beginning of life and those kinds of things, and cloning or genetic testing or those kind of things. I mean, in the broader sense, we can either see science as learning knowledge and wisdom that God gives, or we can see it humanistically. But whilst I think that's a helpful principle, what I've picked up on is that there have been some strong themes that have begun to dominate in some quarters. I think it's still a minority, but quite a vocal minority during my lifetime, during my adult lifetime. And it's the idea that because we want our children to be educated Christianly, that Christians shouldn't educate their children, shouldn't have their children sent to state schools. This actually was being pushed quite strongly through certain quarters when I was at theological college, and there was a number of people that were encouraged to home educate, particularly being influenced by a guy called Douglas Wilson and the Federal Vision, and this is a guy in the United States, pastoring a church, setting up not just his own schools but also his own colleges and sort of university level education and seminary and those kinds of things, and really sort of creating a Christian subculture in a way that you can do in the United States, in certain places, not so much here in the UK. And the idea was that ideally education is in the domain of the home. Often the perception is that it is therefore the mother's duty in the home, and so children are best educated at home. And then the follow through, the flow through from that was that if that wasn't possible, that Christian schools should be set up with a Christian syllabus. Now, I don't have an axe to grind here in terms of what people do with their own children. I think actually this is one of those things where you should have freedom of choice. I don't see anything biblically that insists that education has to be at home. I think the reality is that we live as part of the society. We live in the world. We're not of the world, but we live in the world, and so all of these things are integrated together. I would argue, therefore, that our families are interconnected with the families around us, the communities around us, and so the idea that our children are taught and educated as part of that is not outside of the expectations we see in the New Testament. And I would also want to point out a couple of things. And that's this, that first of all, that there are a lot of really good, really diligent, really passionate Christians in teaching, in education, not just teaching in the classroom, but involved in trying to develop educational policy, in writing the textbooks, and in shaping things. So some people paint this sort of bleak picture of this horrendous pagan environment that our children are going to go into. And there are real challenges in schools, there's real challenges for the teachers as well. But I would say don't write it off. I speak as somebody who is married to a teacher, to an assistant head teacher, and I can see the challenges and the opportunities that there are from that perspective as well. I also would add that at times the battle around home education, Christian school education, feels like the domain of the white middle classes, or those that are already in a position of privilege. And I'm concerned particularly when I see pastors and church leaders and their families making a big deal of their right to either home educate or send their children to a private Christian school. Because if we're fighting for that kind of right, then we're fighting for a right that really only a few of us have. Something that isn't going to be available to the majority of Christians, and certainly isn't going to be available to many of the people that we're seeking to reach with the gospel. The resources are not going to be there, people are not going to have the time, the money to do that themselves. And that also means that we're putting an unnecessary barrier up to the gospel. What do I mean by this? Well, at the moment there's this kind of little subculture, the make Christianity weird again kind of subculture. And I keep seeing in articles, blogs, social media, commentary, people saying Christians should, and evangelicals should just get on with being weird. That we are different and distinct from the world around us, and we should just embrace it. We're never going to be cool, we're never going to be with it, we're never going to be contemporary, we're never going to be respectable. And there's a sense in which that is true, but also there's a sense in which, given that we already are weird, if you like, and we can embrace that unavoidable weirdness, unavoidable distinctiveness, there's no need to make ourselves weirder than we already are. You know, we're never going to be cool as Christians. And that means sort of attempting to sound cool by being into the latest music. Even going to guess at the genre at the moment. Just to be with it when we don't actually like that music it's never going to cut it. People will see through it. And all we will do is make the stuff that we get into uncool. That's not just true of Christianity, that's just true generally of anybody who's over 40. But at the same time, if you do happen to like whatever is currently on trend, then enjoy it. Not to be cool, but just because you enjoy it. What you don't have to do is embrace your inner Cliff Richard. For United States and people anywhere outside of the UK, and I think possibly Australia and a couple of other countries that don't know who the guy is. Cliff Richard is, well, he was the attempt to be the British Elvis. So he, in the 1950s, was one of the forerunners of rock and roll in the United Kingdom. Seen as the guy who made the Beatles possible and everything that followed from that. But Cliff Richard became a Christian, and not just because he became a Christian, but because of, particularly as he grew older, because of wanting to sort of appeal to as broad a market as possible. Sort of the rock and roll edges were cut off. Now he's a guy in his 80s, still performing, and he has been pretty uncool for a long time. And I guess it would be considered weird if you're not an 80-year-old yourself. It would be considered weird to enjoy Cliff Richard's music. Now, I got a confession to make. My guilty pleasure, if you like. We are a family who listen to Cliff Richard and Christopher and Elton John and those kinds of people. I grew up with Cliff Richard, not personally. I grew up with his music because, and his films, because my mum was into him, just as Sarah's dad was into Christopher, and that was inflicted on her, and she enjoyed it. Her sisters, I think, probably resisted that. But I happen to like the stuff, not in some attempt, as some Christians did back 20, 30 years ago, attempt to find a sort of safe Christian version of rock and roll so that I could appear to be cool. I'm more in a way to be weird. I did it. So I like it because I like it. You don't have to embrace Cliff Richard music. You don't have to try, or any of the equivalent. You don't have to try and be weird when it comes to pop culture. Similarly, I was recently sort of taken aback when I saw a picture of guys my age or younger, um, and they're representing a theological college, and they're all pictured, and they're all dressed up in their tweed and their suits, looking like they were sort of upper class people from the 1950s. And it's possible that each of them individually happen to like that way of dressing, like that kind of culture, are from that kind of culture. But I gotta be honest, it looked like a studied and deliberate attempt again to look different, to be what they would maybe see as being countercultural, to be kind of young fogies, if you like. I just think, what are you doing? And in what way is that modelling anything helpful or effective to potential pastors? And that was sort of free church, independent people. We we are bemused, we joke, we tease when we see those pictures of Anglican ordination and those guys sort of in their sort of frilly dress affairs, standing outside cathedrals or leaping up in the air out of cathedrals, and here's reason number 575 why I'm not an Anglican. But those of us that are outside of that spectrum outside of that context, can find our own ways to be weird. Now, I want to remind us that what Scripture talks about is the offence, the scandal of the cross. And I want to remind us of two things here. First, that it's the offence, it's the scandal of the cross. Not the weirdness, not the naffness, not the uncoolness, not the out-of-dateness of the cross. It's the offence, the scandal of it. And secondly, that is the only offence, the only scandal that we are meant to embrace. I should not be putting any other obstacle, any other barrier up against the gospel. And so back to the point I was talking about. If people are looking at the church and looking at Christians in the communities that we're trying to reach, particularly those of us who are trying to reach working class, council estate, inner city cultures, if they're looking at us and they're seeing people who are saying that if you become a Christian, that means taking your kids out of their local primary school, if you are giving them the impression that they've got to start doing home education, or that they have got to make sacrifices to pay for their child to go to a private Christian school, then you've created another offence, another scandal, another obstacle to the gospel. And I think we need to consider that if we're doing that, then we are moving into the territory that Jesus warned about, where we cause little ones to stumble. And so, dare I be so direct as to say that an obsession with home education or Christian school education may be one of those limbs that needs to be cut off. Now, that does bring us back to how do we make sure that education is Christian? And I think there are three things that we can take away from this. First of all, parents, and those that are related into families, uncles, aunties, friends of families, think about the opportunities that you get to help your child make the connections, to help them see things from God's perspective. Be having those conversations as you are eating together, as you're looking at your kids' homework, as you're listening to them read, as you are sat watching TV, as you're looking at their phones with them and looking at YouTube or TikTok or whatever. Secondly, we need to be thinking about how we help our children to make those connections in church, whether that's preaching and teaching at the front so that the children may be getting this via their parents, or what we do in kids group and youth work. That means that really when we think about application of Bible teaching for children and young people, that we need to think wider than the narrow applications that I think we do tend to cover in children's work. I think at times children's work application can be sort of narrowed down to trust in Jesus, so the gospel, and then in terms of living for Jesus, being nice and kind, obeying your parents, that kind of thing. I know that's all good stuff. But we might want to think about how we draw the connections with what they are learning and the positive things that they are learning, so that they get to see God's perspective. Do our children and youth curriculum, do they help our children to look at this world, look at literature, look at science, look at all those things, and see those things from God's perspective? To tie it in with with the theme that we've been looking at in this sort of little series of videos, are you touching on what is happening in Ukraine in your children and youth work? I think we should be. Parents, are you talking to your children about Ukraine and Russia and nuclear weapons and NATO and those kinds of things? I think in an age-appropriate way we should be. The third thing is, I would encourage us to proactively take an interest in schools and education as churches. How can we do that? Well, the obvious and overt way is for vicars and pastors to get into school assemblies or RE lessons. So there's often opportunities to do that, but there are other ways as well. Let's make sure that we are praying for Christians who are teaching. Churches that are meeting schools, pray for those schools. Churches that are near schools, pray for those schools. I think there's a huge benefit in Christians serving as governors or directors and trustees of schools and academies and multi-academy trusts. And I think there's great benefit in encouraging people to consider careers, getting involved in education as teachers, as trustees, as education policy influencers, all those kinds of things. Well, that's certainly taken us on a little detour from our discussion about Ukraine and Donald Trump. But I think there's relevance there as seen towards the end, and we will try and get back on track next time.